Oh, Reagan.
Reagan used to do that.
Open? Mark?
That's how Reagan developed his flair for
Making things
making things up, creative thinking. I
Really?
think so. I think I might have been 9 or 10 when I first was aware of James Thurber. The New Yorker began to come to the house courtesy of an aunt in Greenwich uh, when I was about 10, and the Thurber drawings must have jumped out at me. I was not a New Yorker reader initially, but by the time I was 13, I certainly was a Thurber fan who had a number of his books and had read My Life in Hard Times and a lot of the humorous pieces that appeared. And we're talking here the 40s, the wartime years actually would have been about when I focused in on Thurber. I fell in love with him. I think it was the fact that he both drew and wrote, even though the drawings were really the sort of angst underneath them and the men-women thing and the general take on 30s, 40s anxieties is pretty sophisticated. Nevertheless, the drawings themselves in their shapelessness were so appealing to another amateur artist. And maybe there was enough marital angst around in my household that I could kind of get some of the Thurber captions. But it helped that he also wrote Fables for Our Time and a couple children's books. I mean, there was something in him which was very innocent and could appeal to a child.
Right. Do you remember thinking of him differently as a writer versus a cartoonist, or do you see the relationship between the two, or is it two different things for you?
Some of the sadder fiction probably I could not have, would have seemed to me to exist in a world apart. I mean, the ones, I forget their titles, actually. What's the one? One is a Stranger or something?
Yes.
Those would not have appealed to me, but where the drawings and the text came bundled together, as in Fables for Our Time, it wasn't hard at all to see the link or to imagine that the same man was producing both. In fact, it was important that it be the same man who was producing forth. It somehow made both funnier. That this rather naive but clear drawing was also by the man who wrote this somewhat naive but kind of cunning text.
Right, because he used to say, he'd lament the fact it took him a long time to write, rewriting many times, but the drawings just took him 2 seconds, and he felt that was where he kind of got his unconscious really to come to the fore, because he didn't have to labor over them, and perhaps they have that quality, that spontaneity.
It's interesting to me that Thurber had among his gifts the ability to let the drawings come out. He did them very easily and quickly, and he made rather few attempts, I suppose, to really improve as a draftsman. As Thurber of White once told him, "If you get any better, you'll be bad." And there was enough innocence in him to actually do these doodles in their kind of raw form. There's nothing like them, really. The simplicity of, say, Steinberg is very much an achieved simplicity, whereas Thurber seems to be directly from the psyche somehow, or worse, the old brain stem. I don't know. It's a curious ability that he had of letting it happen.
Yeah, I remember he made one remark that parents would send him the children's drawings and say, my kid can draw as good as you. Why are you so famous? And he would write back, they can draw as well as you, but they haven't been through as much.
Exactly.
I mean, is there, we were talking a little bit earlier, but is there a whole tradition of writers who are also artists or cartoonists that you can put him in context with?
It was quite common in the 19th century for writers to be able to draw. Goethe could draw, Ruskin could draw quite well. Edward Lear, of course, could draw and paint both. I think it was part of a gentleman's equipment often that he'd be able to sketch something in the pre-camera era. And in my own experience, it's very easy to cross over from one to the other. They both involve a pen. They both involve making marks. Something about the idea of making something out of nothing or making something out of white paper is common to both. Haven't been as many in the 20th century, perhaps because our demands of of the visual art are greater, more sophisticated. I don't know. Thurber's one of the few who comes to mind as somebody who was successful in both fields. But the two gifts are really quite allied, much more so than say the musical gift, which I don't have and seems to me quite mysterious, maybe more mysterious than it really is.
Actually, I also think of Max Beerbohm too as someone who did that.
Max Beerbohm was quite an accomplished caricaturist. Evelyn Waugh was an illustrator who actually got paid at one point in his career. So yeah, there were a number of. But Beerbohm perhaps ranks with Thurber as being exemplary in both forms.
Given that he had these talents, is it something that you can imagine someone doing who became totally blind in his later years? I mean, I realize he stopped drawing mostly when he did become blind, but just someone, if we could touch on that one aspect of his story, as a writer yourself and so forth, can you imagine someone being as prolific as he is under those conditions?
No, it was part of his appeal, part of Thurber's appeal to a hero-worshipping young person like myself was that he was doing all this with this severe optical handicap. His drawing, too, no doubt would have been spoiled by more sophistication if he could have seen better. So in a way he was lucky, we could crassly say, because the blindness sort of froze the drawing at a kind of primitive state. But of course it wasn't all he did. He also continued to write, and very touching, toward the end they would show you pieces of Thurber manuscript. I mean, articles about him would show, and it was just a few words in crayon on a big piece of paper. And to think that the man was pushing ahead with the will to express himself was obviously very strong in Thurber. His need to sing his song was very strong.
Can you describe that incident where you received the drawing from him when you were a kid?
I was one of these obnoxious, ambitious kids living in essentially nowhere, a small town in Pennsylvania, and I did write letters to a number of cartoonists, mostly whom I admired. And in those relaxed days, comic strip artists would often send you a strip. They would send you the actual strip of a given day, or a political cartoon. And I wrote Thurber quite a long letter, full of intense admiration, sincere admiration, and I must have been 12, let's say. I got back first a note from his wife saying that Mr. Thurber was in the hospital having an operation, but she took the letter to him and he would be getting back to me. And then some weeks went by, and then a package or an envelope arrived at the house. It contained what was clearly a Thurber drawing, because I knew the signature, but none of us could figure out what it was. And we looked at it for about 3 days as a group. Myself, my parents, and I think my mother's parents all took a part in this game of unriddling. And at last one of us, and I'm not sure it was me, saw that it was a dog sniffing a flower, only with the flower stem bent over in a way that seemed to include it in the physical mass of the drawing. At any rate, I thought it was a very gracious thing for not just a famous and rich man, but a sick man to do, was to send this unknown child the drawing. I've carried it with me wherever I've gone, to college and my various homes since, and I try, when receiving similar letters now, to respond. I realize how easy it is not to respond after a while. It was very good of Thurber, actually, and many years later I wanted to meet him and to thank him for this, and I did meet him. I forget if I expressed my gratitude warmly enough or not.
What was it like? You did meet him, I guess, in London in the 50s, this kind of hero of your childhood. What was it like to suddenly see him for the first time and experience that?
I had known at college Nora Sayre, whose father, Joel Sayre, had been one of the New Yorker crowd and knew Thurber, and she knew that I was a rabid Thurberite, and I was in Oxford, and Thurber happened to be in London, and Nora offered to bring us together, and I accepted. It was I remember, and of course memory is fallible, but it was somebody's house in London, to which they had access around 4 o'clock tea time. Thurber drank immense quantities of iced tea. Maybe he was on the wagon or something. Anyway, I kept wondering as the encounter went on how any bladder could hold so much iced tea as his seemed to be holding. I was, of course, on one hand enchanted and awed by the actual physical presence of the man who had given me so much delight. On the other hand, when he talked, it was like my life and hard times came out of his mouth in a big ribbon. I mean, he had become a monologuist. Maybe the blind especially are tempted to become monologists. And he had held many an audience rapt, and I was happy to be part of his rapt audience that day. But there wasn't much give and take, really.
I don't know if staff is the word, but you were in the offices. Was there kind of a reputation that Thurber had in those years that you remember people talking about? Or?
I was a member of the Talk of the Town staff at the New Yorker from August of '55 to April of '57, so somewhat less than 2 years. Thurber, at that point, was a kind of legend, one of the men who had made the magazine, and I think the magazine at that stage was very aware that Thurber and White and Benchley and a few others had made it the very successful entity it was by that time. Thurber himself, I would see him being led down the hall. He was quite blind by then, and very touching to see the office boy kind of leading this strikingly tall. He was not only really tall, but also he wore his white hair kind of up in a crest like a rooster, so that added a couple more inches to the visual appearance. But these glasses in which his eyeballs were sort of swimming around incoherently. He was a touching sight to me, and as somebody who had read really everything he had written, I was sort of a monument, a walking monument. But he was also, I think, fairly irascible by that point in his evolution, and one would be treated with funny stories about his misbehavior, his drunken misbehavior. He became very pugnacious, and I think a little defensive, because he could feel the New Yorker taste somewhat sliding away from under him. Things would get rejected, not pleasant for any author, but less pleasant maybe even for an older author, because a younger author always has hope, right? Tomorrow you'll show them, whereas for somebody like Thurber, whose name people would love to see in the magazine to get something turned down, must have been very annoying.
Well, I know, I think Angel bore the brunt of a lot of the having to deal with rejecting Thurber in his later years. The difficulty in Thurber writing back and saying there's a whole conspiracy going on to destroy him and get rid of him and so forth.
I didn't know he was that far gone in paranoia or whatever, but I know that Roger did have to give him some bad news occasionally. And it was hard for Roger, who was much younger than the august senior editor he now is.
The whole legend of White and Thurber together working in the same office and sharing that friendship, is that something you were aware of? Well, I guess that would be before your time, but just if you could compare the two in their styles or manner?
E.B. White, in my acquaintance with him, was very low-key and accessible, and also very cogent. The man in person was, as his writing was, quite much to the point and rather laconic. White didn't say more than he had to, really, to cover a given situation. On the other hand, he was very gracious and amusing and very much there. My sense of the old like marriage that Thurber and White had in their little cramped office came through a few times just in hearing the Whites, both Mr. and Mrs. White, talk about Jim, as they called him, and what Jim was doing now. Jim had become quite famous by that point, maybe more famous than either of them, and I think they were sort of amused by the idea of fame. The Whites were people to whom fame was something really in rather dubious taste, and that Thurber was out there not only being famous but kind of relishing it, I think struck them as being in faintly bad taste. At the same time, when they spoke about him, there was still a warmth. I mean, after all, they had been young together. They had done some creative, great things together. So there was something nice that still kind of vibrated from those years. But White was very different. White aged very well, really, and that sort of perky, dry smarts that he had stayed right to the end, or almost to the end.
I think there was a falling off period, I think, between White and Thurber. From what I gathered from the publication of the years with Ross, that the Whites felt that Thurber had really gone over the edge in depicting Ross the way he had, sort of, in some sense, a bumbling old character, provincial and whatnot. I enjoyed the years with Ross very much. I didn't find it a negative portrayal.
I'm sure that Thurber meant the years with Ross kindly. I mean, Ross also appears in some of the fairy tales. I mean, he is the king, the bumptious king, and the white deer, I think. This is Thurber's sense of this incoherent, explosive ruler-type authority figure is very much part of Thurber's general world. One more kind of harassing, ununderstandable force let loose in the world. So that I'm sure The Years with Ross, which I found kind of painful to read myself. It seemed one of those books that isn't true, that isn't quite true, that in some way there was a vast area of Ross that Thurber was blind to. And I think this might have pained not only E.B. White, but his wife, who after all had worked with Ross since they were quite young and who knew Ross very well and understood the editorial process in a way that Thurber didn't want to or deign to. So yeah, I think they also felt that any exposure of the New Yorker's inner workings was indiscreet and very much what Ross would not have wanted. Ross was dead by this time, but the Whites were the custodians, really, of the Ross years, and part of the Ross years, as they construed it, was privacy, great privacy. White himself was truly shy and avoided all public appearances. Even accepting an honorary degree was hard for him. And Mrs. White was not so shy, but she had a Bryn Mawr sense and a Brookline Mass sense of what was correct. And certainly talking about your own editorial workings was not her idea of a good thing to do. So yeah, Thurber's willingness to expose some sense of the New Yorker machinery offended them both, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's interesting that I didn't realize the difference was so dramatic. I mean, certainly Thurber just, towards the end, just anybody want to interview him, he did it, and he didn't care what they wrote about him as long as he was in the center of attention. Do you remember reading the Thurber album? Kind of a series of sketches about people from Columbus that are very accurate portrayals of people.
Yes, the Thurber album was kind of late Thurber. He had already been over Columbus, creating a masterpiece of humor, My Life in Hard Times, and some other sketches, and this was a more grave, a more serious attempt to reconstruct again his past. I did read it with pleasure. At that point I was very much a Thurberite and kind of hooked and would read anything he wrote. It certainly is not a masterpiece the way some of the comic pieces are, and maybe if Thurber hadn't already done such great things, the New Yorker wouldn't have been willing to run those sweet but maybe faintly tepid portraits. I don't know. It's been many years since I read it, and I might be doing it an injustice.
So he was very unhappy that his family didn't like the fact that he wrote about them, even though they're pretty tame pieces on the whole. But his brother wrote back these letters, you never talked about our father's great handwriting or penmanship, for instance. And Thurber got so furious, said, this is hopeless. I thought these were endearing portraits. I'll never write about anyone again that is real. He did with Ross. But is that something that you can relate to as an author with your own experience of writing about people that are clearly about somebody that's real? Can you imagine that?
My limited experience is once you give the real name of a person that you're going to write about, you're in some trouble because all of the social rules suddenly come into play. If you give them a false name and invent them, in a sense, under this new name, you're no longer obliged to tell the truth. In fact, it's much better if you wander from the truth, if you give them a little bit of your own fantasies, so that it's a much smaller, I think, artistic arena, that a reminiscence or the memoir. and people are rarely pleased. That's somewhat surprising. I think writers think, knowing how hard it is to write anything that makes even a little sense, they imagine that their subjects will be pleased to be written about. But it turns out that they are not. What they spot is what you left out, what you missed, what you didn't say, and people's own image of themselves is generally more heightened than anything a writer can do justice to. So I don't know how sincere Thurber was in really being surprised. By that time, he was a veteran writer and should have known that you're not apt to please your subjects, especially back in Columbus, where they had their own pride, their own sense of themselves, and their own sense of Thurber perhaps as kind of a wild man, a maverick, the colt that got away, kind of.
Maybe talk a little bit, if we could, about the actual style and his use of words. He called himself the old word man. That was something that he played a lot with, and he enjoyed the use of language. That's something you have a recollection of?
In the later Thurber pieces, they're almost all about words, aren't they? The blind man's world had closed in, so it became purely a dictionary kind of world, and some of them are quite funny, but it's a pretty slim platform, isn't it, to launch yourself from. I think always he was not a natural writer in the way that White was. You feel that White's style, maybe wrongly, but you feel that White's style tumbled out of his thoughts fairly easily. He once described in one piece, writing a piece, leaning over a typewriter and thinking hard for 18 minutes. Well, 18 minutes isn't an awful long time, after all, to devote to a couple hundred words.
Oh, yeah, that would be something that...
Because I'd like to get this in.
Yeah, I think that would be nice to...
It's interesting.
The following is Wild Sound from Sound Roll 3.
On the other hand, when he talked, it was like My Life in Hard Times came out of his mouth in a big ribbon. I mean, he had become a monologuist. Maybe the blind especially are tempted to become monologists. And he had held many an audience rapt, and I was happy to be part of his rapt audience that day. But there wasn't much give and take, really. He could hardly see me after all. I tried to describe the way the New Yorker cartoons look now, and he was interested, but only just barely. And so, in a sense, it was one of those encounters with authors that might as well have not taken place, since it slightly diminished, in a way, the pleasure and my pleasure and respect that I'd taken in his work. I just saw him then as a man. I think we all have the notion that authors write their particular pieces out of an infinite realm of possible pieces, and it's a shock to realize that they pretty much have said all that they have to say, and to hear Thurber repeating the stories out of Columbus again, when I just read them, was maybe a little disillusioning.
We have to change the roles.
Oh, okay.
As the role?
It is always painful, because I remember reading an article in the New Yorker about a woman who went to visit E.B. White up in Maine. It was about 6 months ago. I think, I can't remember the circumstance, but she was so disillusioned.
She was the biographer of White's wife. She was Captain White's biographer, yeah.
He didn't say anything to her at all.
You want to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, when you were at the New Yorker for a brief period, actually part of the, I guess...
Speak?
I don't know if staff is the word, but you were in the offices. Was there kind of a reputation that Thurber had in those years that you remember people talking about?